For years, I noticed women working in high-end escorting describing remarkably similar psychological changes. One spoke about feeling emotionally distant from people she actually cared about. Another described constantly reading people, even outside of work, even when there was no reason to. Someone else said she no longer knew where the role ended and she began. Others talked about relationships, feeling different than they used to. About rest, no longer feeling like rest. About becoming exceptionally good at understanding clients. Well, her own voice, the one with no role to play, grew quieter and quieter. They all believed they were describing something personal, something unique to their own situation. I don't think they were. I think they were describing different expressions of the same psychological process. I wanted to understand that process. That's why I began studying it and eventually developed the Psychology for Escorts Framework. I'm Eva Valora. I'm a psychologist, but long before I became one, I spent years working as a high-end escort myself. I lived this world before I could explain it. When I began my training in psychology, one question stayed with me. What actually happens in the mind when the psychological demands of this work are repeated day after day, year after year? I searched for a framework that could explain it. A framework that explained how repeated psychological demands of paid intimacy and companionship gradually shape the nervous system, the mind, and eventually identity. That framework didn't exist, so I built it. There was research on trauma, on stigma, on prostitution and violence, on mental health outcomes, all of it important, but none of it explained the gradual psychological adaptations I kept observing. They weren't dramatic, they were quiet, gradual, the kind of change that doesn't appear in a crisis, but accumulates through repeated experiences of paid intimacy and companionship. Most research asked, what problems does this work cause? The Psychology for Escorts Framework asked a different question. What does this work repeatedly ask of the mind and nervous system? Because the nervous system doesn't organize itself around labels. It doesn't respond to what something is called. It responds to what is repeatedly asked of it. And when those demands are repeated often enough, the nervous system adapts. That simple shift in perspective became the foundation of the Psychology for Escorts Framework. The framework consists of 6 core psychological mechanisms. They are not 6 separate concepts. They are one adaptive system. These mechanisms continuously influence one another as the nervous system adapts to the repeated psychological demands of paid intimacy. For many women, that process begins even before the first client, long before the work starts. Psychological contracts are already forming. Internal agreements like, this is just work. I won't get emotionally involved. I'll stay in control. I can keep my personal life separate. These contracts don't determine what will happen, but they shape how the work is understood from the very beginning. Once the work begins, the psychological demands are repeated again and again. Every work encounter requires emotional regulation. Reading another person, adjusting, maintaining a specific atmosphere. That is emotional labor. And repeated often enough, emotional regulation becomes increasingly automatic. Alongside it, another adaptation is constantly required: containment, the ability to hold emotional intensity without expressing it or absorbing it. The nervous system learns to regulate internal responses while maintaining external composure. That capacity is adaptive, and every adaptation has consequences. The kind of containment we're talking about is not the kind most people encounter in everyday life. It develops within a unique psychological environment, one where money, desire, and intimacy continuously intersect, where power is constantly negotiated, and where attraction and desire are continuously managed. Within the Psychology for Escorts framework, this psychological environment is described through the mechanism of power and desire. Working repeatedly within that environment requires the mind to hold multiple realities at the same time. That naturally creates the need for another adaptation: functional dissociation. The ability to decide how much of an experience is allowed to enter while remaining fully present. To stay engaged without allowing every experience to become personally absorbed. As the psychological demands of the work are repeated, work encounter after work encounter, the adaptations they create gradually become the nervous system's default way of responding. That is nervous system adaptation. The strategies no longer remain limited to work. They begin to shape relationships, rest, closeness, and eventually identity itself. When these 6 mechanisms become stable, they tend to produce 3 long-term adaptive effects. The first is invisible costs. The system becomes highly efficient. That efficiency is real and functional. But the cost of maintaining it remains difficult to see, precisely because the system has learned to absorb them without signaling distress. The second is identity shifts. The adaptations don't stay in the working self. Over time, they begin to organize how someone experiences herself outside of work. What she needs, how she connects, what feels safe, what doesn't. The third is integration. Eventually, the question shifts. It's no longer, how do I undo these adaptations? It becomes, how do I understand them well enough to integrate them into a broader, more complete sense of who I am? That shift from problem to integration is what this framework is designed to support. This framework was not built to tell women who they became. It was built to explain why certain changes happen. Because understanding is where integration begins. I'm Eva Valora. If you want to know more about the framework, you can go to my website, Psychology for Escorts.